Dear Dr. Berezow, we are happy to greet you in the framework of the project Challenges of Source Evaluation in Science and Correlated Areas. And since you have currently one of your main activities is related to writing about science and public activity, public speaking when it comes to debunking junk science for American Council of Science and Health. So my question is, what has brought you to this field?
An overwhelming need for it. So I got my PhD in microbiology, and then after I was about halfway through my PhD when I realized I didn't really like what I was doing. And so I decided I was going to go into science journalism, and I became a science journalist. And I founded a website called Real Clear Science. It's part of a series of websites that are part of the Real Clear Politics family of websites. And I became a journalist, and I did that for 6 years. And I noticed as part of my journalism career just how much misinformation there was on the internet, in cable news, in the newspaper, about science. And so I started to debunk it, and I would start writing about how this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, you know, the news coverage is all wrong. And it got to the point where I was convinced that most science news coverage was actually incorrect, okay? And there was this organization called the American Council on Science and Health that had been founded in 1978, and I came across them, and I realized they'd be a really good fit for me. Because all I was doing was debunking junk science, and that's what they were founded to do, specifically in regard to health, nutrition, epidemiology, and they hired me. And so in 2016, I joined them, and I've been there ever since.
Thank you. So since you said that you've been a science journalist for 6 years, so I didn't know this before. So my question is the following. Alex, so what are things that a journalist is allowed to do, but a scientist is not allowed to do when it comes to using sources? Certainly, I mean, journalism is more, I mean, it gives some more space for a journalist to do things. For instance, a scientist cannot use the same journalistic methods in order to make a conclusion, for instance.
Sure. So if you're writing a paper for a scientific journal, you would not use CNN or BBC as a news source. Okay, you just can't. You have to use other peer-reviewed journals as sources for your papers. But when you're a journalist, you can use pretty much anything as long as it's legitimate. So therefore, I can use science journals as a source of information, but I can also use CNN, BBC, you know, New York Times, whatever news source is a trustworthy news source, that's fair game, and it's considered legitimate to use that sort of information. So in a way, journalists have a little bit more freedom than scientists do because we can use more sources.
And so when it comes to science, currently we are speaking about humanities as well. I mean, you understand, right? Because I mean, I
don't, but okay.
So, do I understand correctly that in the US, when we say science, we are speaking only about exact sciences?
Yeah, well, it's a controversy, okay? When I speak about science, and when most scientists speak about science, I would say they're talking about what we would call the hard sciences, which would be physics, chemistry, biology, medicine. Some will include psychology in that, but then we start getting into the softer sciences, economics, the humanities. These are generally not considered sciences in this country, anyway.
So for the purpose of this interview, then I would be saying in certain questions, science and other academic fields, because people that would be watching this interview, they're not only from the US, but Europe and post-Soviet era. And
sure.
Especially in Europe, I mean, people call science, even philosophy, as a science, so that is all science that is considered as such. I mean, you probably know this.
We're defining our terms. That's very good.
And you probably know this, how people use this term science. There are always these misunderstandings between scholars from different continents.
And people try to use the word science inappropriately because they want to make something they're saying sound more important than it actually is, right? They'll say, well, this is what the science says. And it's not necessarily what follows is a scientific statement, right? But they want to make it sound important or very thoroughly researched. They make comments like that. And yeah, so that's one of the things that I caution against, because this is what I do for a living, is debunking junk science. And so I caution against things like that.
So Dr. Berezow, could we speak now about what are the criteria of whether something is scientific or not scientific? So you already mentioned about methodology, so could you please elaborate on other criteria as well?
Science is not just a process of experimentation, it's also a process of peer review and deriving at some sort of consensus, right? And so there are these overarching themes in scientific fields. For instance, in biology, the theme is evolution. Nothing really makes sense in biology unless you consider evolution as sort of the driving force behind everything in biology. The same thing with chemistry. Nothing really makes sense in chemistry unless you understand the theory of the atom, the atomic theory, and how that works. In physics, it's going to be some combination of mechanics, Newtonian mechanics, and Einstein's general relativity and quantum mechanics, right? Nothing really makes sense unless you consider these frameworks, these theories that the fields work in. I would contend that hard sciences and any scientific pursuit has this overarching theme, and that the vast majority of people in that field subscribe to that theory. And they say, yes, this theory is correct, this is what we all are working on, and everything we research is sort of under this umbrella, under this theme that we are pursuing. And that is kind of what I would classify as sort of a mature science, has that sort of characteristic.
But when it comes to science, I mean, roughly speaking, I mean, as an end result, that scientific result, wherever conclusion, discovery should be applicable. I mean, it should help people in some way, right? But there are a lot of sciences that are just there. They make certain conclusions that are not practical at all. So would we consider this sciences to be like scientific?
I don't think applicability matters. And the reason is because you have no idea where research is going to go. Okay, and let me give you a very relevant example. These biologists, one of them's name is Jennifer Doudna, and I can't remember the other person's name, another lady, but they just won the Nobel Prize for learning about this system called CRISPR. And CRISPR is the way that bacteria have their own immune systems. And they have a way of recognizing which viruses have infected them previously, and they can fight back against those viruses. It's a very primitive immune system, but they have one. Now you might say, well, that's great for the bacteria. What practical application does that have? And at the time, the answer was nothing. There is no practical application for this. It's just interesting research. Well, lo and behold, it became the most powerful tool we now have to genetically modify organisms. And now we're talking about curing people's diseases, genetic diseases. We're talking about easier ways of making genetically modified crops, genetically modified animals, even editing human embryos for fixing genetic diseases. That all came out of this research. And at the time, it was just a pure curiosity. Pure curiosity drove the research, and now it ended up becoming a world-changing technology. So no, I would not say applicability is a criteria simply because you don't know what will become applicable in the future.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Dr. Berezow, in 2017, you have authored a book titled A Little Black Book of Junk Science. Would you mind please briefly describing what that book is about?
Well, in this country, a lot of politicians like to carry around a little copy of the U.S. Constitution in their pockets. And I thought, you know what, they ought to have a little book that tells them all the things that are wrong that they hear about science on a daily basis. And so I thought, okay, let's have a little black book of junk science, and they can keep that in their pocket too. And basically it was our way of I think we covered well over 100 topics in there, and we just gave up like a 1 or 2 sentence brief discussion of a topic that they've probably heard in the media and what the truth is, in our estimation, what we believe the truth is about that topic, and whether or not it's something that's real or something that's junk science. And ended up being kind of popular. We still get people writing to us telling us, oh, it was a really great book. And so we're proud of that. We think we maybe have had a small impact with that book.
So the book is, the key word is junk science there. So I was wondering if there is any difference between so-called pseudoscience and junk science. What are this?
Not really. They're sort of used interchangeably. Although I would say that if you become technical about it, pseudoscience usually refers to things like Yeti and Loch Ness Monster and UFOs and so sort of paranormal activity and things like that, whereas junk science is potentially legitimate science but based on very bad data. I think that's sort of the difference. So somebody that says that eating too much hot dogs will cause lung cancer, that's junk science. Okay, could it be true? Yeah, it could be true, but that sounds like it's based on really bad data. Whereas if someone says the Loch Ness Monster is real, this is not even really a scientific field. Now you're kind of in the paranormal area, and so I think that's sort of the difference. But here I sort of used interchangeably.
So I wonder if you can shed a light. What are the current tendency in the U.S. academia against fighting the junk science? What people do. I'm sure there are a lot of colleagues of yours that are also doing this type of activity. So basically, do I understand correctly that the main goal is basically to inform as many people as possible about things like this?
Yeah, right now the coronavirus is keeping pretty much everybody busy, myself included. There are so many ideas out there about the coronavirus, that it was genetically created by the Chinese. That's not true. That there are certain drugs that can treat it, like hydroxychloroquine. It's not true. And unfortunately, these myths don't die because of social media. And they just live forever and ever and ever like zombies. You expect that once the myth has been killed that it goes away, and it doesn't. It just keeps coming back. And so I find that is what a lot of us are focusing on, is that you have to keep repeating yourself over and over and again, because certain myths just don't die. And because the coronavirus is literally the only thing people are talking about right now, that's where all of our efforts are focused. I actually wrote an article a few months ago on the worst conspiracy theories about the coronavirus, and they're still around. In China, they believe that the Americans created the coronavirus and planted it in China, and so yeah, and so there are a lot of strange theories out there that we're constantly fighting against.
Mm-hmm. So Alex, not to take the side or take the side of junk science. So here's my question. Wouldn't it have been more concise to use words such as invalid or unreliable, especially when we speak about, there are certain statements made that are really very unreliable. it's obvious that they're just making headlines. So is it necessary that we basically, not label, that we address something as a junk science?
It depends. Junk science has a certain poetry about it that it's really, it's a nice term to use. But I would agree with you that, let's say that there is a scientific group that does a research paper, and I think it's wrong. I think that they came to the wrong conclusion. They have bad data. I would never call that junk science if I thought they were doing it with honest intentions and they were just honestly wrong. I would never call something like that junk science, because people make mistakes. and scientists are people, scientists make mistakes. And as long as science is conducted with good faith, good effort, and they're trying to find the truth, and if they just happen to be wrong, we all get things wrong.
What about situations like as follows? Let's say there is a very highly reputable, authoritative scientist. It doesn't matter in which field. And since there are so many people that assess a certain source based on who is the author of it. And many people do not even think that an authoritative scientist might make a mistake as well. How would you commend the situation? Is it fine that people pay so much attention to the author and not the source itself?
Yeah, that's a problem. And we're all susceptible to this bias, because even if I have an idea and I read an opposite idea, and it comes from somebody who's a very famous name and who's famous in that field, I'll question myself before I question him, okay? I think that's just a bias that we're inbuilt, because people who spend a long time on these things, we want to defer to their expertise. It's a natural thing to do. However, I mean that they're perfect either. There was this movement in medicine several years ago into what they call evidence-based medicine, which meant medicine should be practiced based on what the scientific evidence is. I've been practicing for years before that, that they sort of made up the name afterward. They referred to it as eminence-based medicine, that the medicine was practiced based on what the most eminent people in the field said about it. So if this family does this is what the doctors do. And they realized, this isn't the best approach for our patients, because sometimes the experts are wrong. And so they switched over to evidence-based medicine, and I think the same thing is true of science. We want to focus on evidence than eminence.
So if we speak about approaching how to assess and choose sources of information, since we do not have one uniform international common standard about the classification of sources, which are fine to use in the research and which are not, do you personally, as a scientist, do you have a certain classification or a model that you use in assessing and choosing a source for research?
In regard to the quality of a scientific journal?
Here's the point. Not only scientific journal could be a source of information, of scientific information, right? There are a lot of sources. So which ones do you prioritize? For some, it's an experiment. For some, it's a monograph, etc.
Sure. Okay. So when I'm looking, or let's say that I'm going to do research on a field that I know absolutely nothing about, okay? My first instinct is to go to literatures. So I go to the prominent journals and I go, what is the latest review on this? And right away, you get sort of an idea of what the consensus is in the field. So, for instance, I would go to Nature Medicine or Nature Microbiology or something like that and look up the latest review on a particular topic within that field. That gives me a general idea. Then I can start looking up more of the recent papers. What are some of the recent papers? What are people saying about this field now? And if it happens to have a regulatory or legal aspect, then I can go to a government website and see, well, what's the government saying about this topic? Are there certain regulations? Are there certain, if it's cell phones, do cell phones cause cancer? Well, we have a government website that talks about that, and they say, no, it doesn't. And so I trust that the FDA and the American regulatory agencies are right more often than they're wrong. And so that's kind of what I do. Look for reviews, look for the latest papers, and look for government websites. And between those, I can generally get a pretty good idea of what the truth is.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about academia in general, scientists as well, using free encyclopedias as their tool for the starting point of the research, especially Wikipedia?
Well, yeah, Wikipedia is a mixed bag. It's certainly it's got its uses. If I want to look up, the population of Kazakhstan or something, Wikipedia is very good for that. But if I want to get a balanced perspective on the history of some topic, Wikipedia is terrible for this because it's biased. And it's biased usually by, it tends to be white male English speakers who write Wikipedia. So, it's going to be biased in one particular direction. And so, it's an okay point to get your idea, maybe a long point, but I certainly wouldn't anyone basing an research paper or something off of Wikipedia or free encyclopedias. No.
And so coming to the person himself, not to speak only about scientists, just because science, the way people understand science in America, could we speak about what makes a scholar? I mean, what does it take for him to be a real scholar?
Great question. What makes a scholar? I think someone who is doggedly interested in pursuing the truth, no matter what the truth is. For instance, I think a scholar needs to be open-minded. And by open-minded, everybody thinks they're open-minded, and most people are not open-minded. Because what open-minded means is you take your most true beliefs, things that have been true your entire life, and you examine them. And you look at the evidence, and does the evidence support your belief? And if the answer is no, you should change your belief. Very few people are willing to do that. And I think that the true hallmark of a scholar is somebody who is able to change their mind when the facts change.
Why, American science, if we can say so, let's say science in North America, is so different from European one, and European one correspondingly is so different from the post-Soviet area?
I don't think there's a big difference between the way science is practiced in Europe and in the United States. I know for a fact that the United States has collaborations all over the world. It's common for us to have collaborators. In fact, my research group, when I was in graduate school, we had collaborators in England, we had collaborators in China. The scientific community, that's one of the most beautiful things about science, is that it's an international language, because as long as everybody agrees to the same set of rules, observation, hypothesis, experiment, and revision of those hypotheses, anybody can play. You don't have to speak the same language. You don't have to speak English. You can speak Japanese or whatever. And as long as you're playing by the same rules, science is an international endeavor. And so as long as the rules are followed, anybody can play.
But when you say the rules, are there any rules in science? I mean, we have them, but they're very weak. I mean, where do they come from, these rules?
Well, the scientific community sort of polices itself. That's what the peer review process is about. So if I write a paper and I did not do an experiment correctly, let's say I forgot a control group, the peer reviewers will catch it and they'll say, you broke the rules. You needed to have a control group here. You didn't do it. And so it's a self-policing authority, and that's the whole point of peer review. It's to make sure that all the proper protocols were followed before a paper is published.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Berezow, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure.
Oh, likewise. Thank you.